really enjoyed the introduction to Sylvia Beach in The Paris Bookseller by Carrie Maher. Sylvia Beach is an American expatriate who moves to Paris and through a turn of events opens up an English book shop called Shakespeare and Company. It is very famous. There are so many different writers during that time that come into her life. She runs the English bookshop. Her partner Adrian runs a French bookshop. It was hard not to feel that Paris was the place. The two main complaints that I have about this book is, number one, it really went way down in the depths of her printing Ulysses by James Joyce. Ulysses was banned in the United States. They couldn't find a printer. She agreed as a bookshop owner to get it printed, which for during that time was quite a novel idea. Secondly, there are so many interesting stories that I later learned about Sylvia Beach, about how she was able to trick the Nazis and move all of the books out of her bookshop to a different area of the building so that when the Nazis came to take her product, there was nothing there, there was no sign, they couldn't even tell there had even been a bookshop. Really interesting stories about that. This book just seemed to be a snapshot of her life, and I really was left wanting a longer length of time of learning about her. There are some documentaries that I found and was able to watch.
And the French writers were very interested in the English and the American writers, and they encouraged me with all the young writers, and Valerie Noble used to be very encouraging too.
I really learned a lot watching those as well. When I walk into a bookstore, any bookstore, first thing in the morning, I'm flooded with a sense of hushed excitement. The Yellow Lighted Bookshop by Louis Busby is a memoir that also includes historical accounts of booksellers. And he really goes into depth on the bookseller trade, even explaining how there are closeout book sales and who gets the profits, and he shares all of his experience of working in bookstores. Overall, I really found it fascinating with not only his experience, but also by sharing what has happened back in history as far as the bookseller trade. The Old North Bell tolls the hour, and I realize that I'll be late. The Personal Librarian by Marie Benedict and Victoria Christopher Murray was phenomenal. I listened to the audiobook by Robin Miles and cannot recommend it high enough. This is about Marion Greener, or better known as Belle da Costa Green, who was an African-American woman who passed as white with Brazilian roots. She was famously the curator of the acquisitions for J.P. Morgan's Library of J.P. Morgan fame. Marie Benedict co-wrote The Personal Librarian with Victoria Murray for the African-American perspective.
Anne's jaw clenches. You think you're so clever with your little threats. But don't forget that the tally is in my favor. The celebration of its opening rages on all around me, and I've been raging right alongside it. Are you quite all right, Miss Green?
From what I can tell, they did a phenomenal job with research and historical accuracy. I loved that this story spanned most of her life, and especially enjoyed the fierceness that she exhibited as a woman in a mostly male industry. You have in your hands the story of Property Jones. The Bookshop Girl by Sylvia Bishop is a early middle grade novel, so your elementary age readers. And this is the story of Property Jones, who, along with her family, end up coming into ownership of the Great Montgomery Book Emporium. This is this magical bookstore. And while Property has a secret that she's been keeping that does affect her family, It actually is the reason why she is able to end up in a position to be able to save this emporium from dastardly disaster. This was not my favorite book, but again, for somebody who is in elementary school and able to read early middle grade books, this would be fine. Your ad in the Saturday Review of Literature says that you specialize in out-of-print books. 84 Charing Cross Road by Helene Hanff. This is an epistolary novel. It's a series of letters over years between Helene Hanff, who is a freelance writer in New York City, and a man who works for a used book dealer in London. This book was so funny, really, because of Helene. She's just so funny. I loved her sarcasm and wit, and just her confidence exudes in this in a way that is just, she just says the funniest things. It's incredibly short, but great. I highly recommend it. There also is a movie with Anthony Hopkins, but my experience is it was completed, I think, in the 80s, and so the videography is not super crisp, and it's very similar to the book, and I just really felt like the book had a lot more personality than the movie did.
1. August, 1939. London, England. Grace Bennet had always dreamed of someday living in London. Never did she imagine it would become her only option.
The Last Bookshop in London by Madeline Martin is also phenomenal. I listened to this as well. It is read by Saskia Marlevade. Normally I listen to audiobooks pretty fast, at least a 1.5, sometimes all the way up to a 2.0. But I found with this book, I slowed it down so that I could make it last. I loved it that much. It's a very wholesome tale about a character named Grace who ends up coming to London with a friend. She doesn't really have any employment prospects, but she manages to get a job working in Primrose Hill Bookshop. It reminded me a lot in the beginning with the Christmas Bookshop by Jenny Colgan, with the idea that in this old, disorganized bookshop, Grace needs to organize it and declutter it and fix everything up and kind of make it more enticing to customers. So she's actually not that much of a reader, but she is gifted, I think, the Three Musketeers, and it develops into a passion for reading. And so all throughout the actual Blitz descriptions of bombs landing and people hiding in the tube and her nights as a watch person, and in a time when the community is hit really hard, she is part of the recovery process, and it is just such a beautiful story, and I cannot recommend it high enough. Funeral receptions can be tough spots to find enjoyment, but 11-year-old Edmund Pierce was doing his best. A Place to Hang the Moon by Kate Albus is the story of three children in the 1940s. It's William, Edmund, and Anna, who end up losing their last living family member. It's a grandmother. And they are sent, just like many other children during wartime in London, they are sent out into a rural area to kind of wait out the war. Because they don't have any other living family members, the idea here is that they go and secretly try to find a family. The reason why it's secret is because financially they don't want to share anything, because they don't want someone to want to be part of their family for nefarious reasons. And this is their story of staying in this community, trying to find a family that could be meant for them. This book gets really high reviews. I know the homeschool community loves it. Read Aloud Revival, Sarah Mackenzie highly recommends it. And I also really loved it. It is pretty hard hitting. It is not lightweight. You know, I think sometimes I'm reticent to get into these three children that end up getting sent out of London during the bombs because I loved A Lion, a Witch, and a Wardrobe, and I'm not sure if anyone can ever do that again without there being this comparison. There is a nod to it, hence the name of Edmund for one of the characters, but it really does hit differently, and I loved it, and it is going on our shelf as a family read aloud for next year. The last time I saw my uncle, he bought me a dog. The Bookshop of Yesterdays by Amy Meyerson is a very modern story. Main character is Miranda. She ends up inheriting her uncle's bookshop. Knowing that he left her the bookshop, he has left her a scavenger hunt for her to kind of unravel what went wrong between her mother and him, because at some point there's a rift in the family and she doesn't end up really seeing him that much or speaking to him that much. And so it's an interesting story. All in all, I loved the quirkiness of the characters. I loved Miranda developing as a character as the book progresses, and think that this was a good bookshop book. The new year was barely 15 hours old in Troublesome Creek, Kentucky, when my pa adjusted the cording candle, setting it to burn for an alarming length of time. The Bookwoman of Troublesome Creek by Kim Michelle Richardson is another historical fiction that I read. And this novel follows Cussie Mary, and she is a pack horse librarian in the Appalachia in Kentucky. And this really gives a good insight into the superstitious nature of the people, their perspectives on anyone who looks different than them or acts different than them, and how she is able to challenge the community that she grows up in. And so the thing that I was really surprised about this is true that there were people in Kentucky that actually had a shade of blue skin. There is a physiological reason for this. Now we can kind of look back and know what that is, but at the time no one could really understand it. And the people with blue skin were treated just as people who had a non-white skin. And so this is her experience kind of connecting with the African Americans in the area, and also really fighting against the racist viewpoint of the people in her community. I learned so much about this and did not know anything about it prior to picking up this book. So just on that merit alone, would recommend everyone read this. Numbers floated round my head like stars. The Paris Library by Janet Charles is a dual timeline historical fiction novel. One part of it is in Montana in the 80s, and then the first part of it is in Paris right around World War II. The main character, Odile Souchet, worked at the American Library in Paris. So there are people in Paris who were foreigners and not really feeling like they fit in. They really connected at this American library in Paris. In the 80s, this is a story about Lily, who is a teenager, and she is having some family trauma, and she ends up connecting with her neighbor, who turns out to be Odile Souchet, who has moved from Paris in the 50 years in between and is now in Montana. And so Lily and this Parisian woman connect up, and through multiple events, we are told the story of what happened in Paris. Overall, I love these World War II historical fictions. I love the connection of the library in it. What I didn't like was the dual timeline of this teenager, and really just kept waiting to get back into Paris. The mystery unfolds, but I just wish it was done in a different way than through this teenage character in Montana. How on earth could I have let them talk me into it? The Little Paris Bookshop by Nina George has main character Monsieur Perdu, who considers himself a literary apothecary. He has a bookstore that is on this barge that is stationary on the Seine, and he has an apartment in a nearby area. Right at the beginning of the bat, we realize there's something kind of going on mentally with him. He has a locked up room in this apartment that he doesn't go into, but because someone is in need, he goes into this locked room, and through that experience, he sort of has this mental breakthrough and decides that he is going to take his stationary barge and get it on the move. And so he goes on the lam. He's got a couple characters that he collects as he goes down the Seine, a writer who has a block, a chef, and they have all kinds of kind of what I would consider strange hijinks. Overall, as much as I love the Paris setting and this idea of an apothecary barge on the lam going down the Seine River, going through the countryside of France, this was just not my favorite. It really did pull in a lot of modern elements, and so there were just some things in there that were not my favorite situations and tropes. And so while it was very thought-provoking, it was not one of my favorites. The bookshop is feeling blue today. The Bookshop of Dust and Dreams by Mindy Thompson is a book that I really wanted to read, so much so that I used up my Amazon credits to purchase this on Kindle because I could not get it from my library or Scribd. So this takes place in the 40s with a main character of Poppy and her family and her brother. And Poppy's family owns this magical bookshop called Rhyme and Reason. There actually is quite a bit of world building in this book for a middle grade book, in that you really have to understand the rules of this bookshop and then the community of other magic bookshops and how the interaction between the magic and the real world happens. There's time travel, and I think it's pretty believable, especially as a middle grade book. I will say, it was surprisingly hard-hitting. There were a lot of challenging topics that were addressed, mainly surrounding war and the losses that you can experience in war. There are twists and turns and unreliable characters, and overall a really intriguing read. I've not read a book that this reminds me of. It's that unique, and so I would recommend it. I would suggest that before handing it to your middle grader, that you would read it first to make sure that all of these hard-hitting topics are appropriate, because some of them are difficult, especially for a sensitive reader, but overall a good book. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time.